Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. Today, a look at the media. We will do it from several angles because the media doesn't just tell you what the news stories of the day are. They provide their version of the context, which is designed to help you assess and think about those particular stories. And I should mention as we begin our conversation that this is actually the first election, I think, in history where the media, writ large, not just the CBC, has a direct financial stake in the outcome of this election. So we will discuss that with two of our favorite people. Peter Menzies writes a Substack called The Rewrite, 3 decades in the newspaper business, time as the vice chair of the CRTC. And Tara Henley, host and creator of Lean Out, a podcast. She wrote a book with the same name, subtitled A Meditation on the Madness of the Modern World. So here we are, just following up on that concept. And together they do a podcast on the media for The Hub called Full Press. So welcome to you both. Great to see you.
Good to be here.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Good. So can we start with perhaps that latter point that the media, and because I still talk to people that have no idea the degree to which the legacy mainstream media is being directly subsidized by government funds and by funds from the Google accounts, the companies that were asked and forced by law to put money aside. Peter, do you want to just give us your take on that to start?
Well, I think it is the very first election in history where most of the media, almost all of the media covering it, have a financial stake in the outcome. I think what's the most troubling is that, I'll give the CBC credit because, they've always had a bit, but I don't think they've been in an election before where one guy's saying, I'll double your funding eventually, and the other guy saying, I'm going to take your funding away, where it's that dramatic a difference. And I'll give Brodie Fenlon credit, like he said, we're in an inescapable conflict of interest here. He's their editor-in-chief. Good for him for coming clean. I almost think, though, that there should be a little crawler at the bottom of the screen that says something about it. Most disappointing is the rest of the media don't say anything at all about it. And I worry about that mostly because I think it undermines the credibility of their journalism. There's some good journalism and there's some bad journalism taking place. But unless you're upfront about this stuff, it's, like you said, a lot of people don't know. And the reason they don't know is because media don't tell them. And the reason they don't tell them is because if they did know, they would trust them less and they wouldn't like it. So it's been really interesting to watch. And regardless of the outcome, I think media will be less trusted at the end of this election than they were before it.
Tara, just picking up on that point, because the Hub, and we all listen to it all the time, they got their check in the mail and immediately gave it to charity and then challenged other mainstream, whether it's the National Post or the Globe and Mail or CTV or whatever it is, and said, okay, you're going to get the money. We get that. And you're all struggling. So you're going to, but at least tell us how much and what you use it for. Is it salaries or is it sending people on, election campaigns or other stories? And zero take up as far as I can see.
It's a pretty astonishing set of circumstances. It is very unprecedented that this election, the stakes for the media personally are so high. And this comes down to the level of individual journalists as well. You know where your organization is funded, and you know that one guy is saying that he may repeal the subsidies and the other guy is for the subsidies. And so I think that this is a really big conflict of interest. If you follow the rules of conflict of interest that we use anywhere else in the media, this would certainly be considered a conflict of interest. And at the very minimum, there should be disclosures. I agree that the public is not fully aware of this, but those that are outraged by it. And this is going to result in lost public trust in the media at a time when we do not need to be hemorrhaging any more trust.
I want to talk a little bit about framing with both of you. This is a concept that has been around forever in those people that write academically about journalism, but the real power of mainstream media is to really give you the frame through which you look at and listen to and hear the reports and the information that they're presenting. We tend to just talk a little bit about bias of the reporters or the particular organizations, but framing, Peter, is a way more powerful concept because it's much subtler than just sometimes the obvious bias that you hear.
Well, it's almost like writing a story with a foregone conclusion.
Yeah.
When you can get into that, and that can be dangerous. I mean, I've seen that done with assignment editors. And
Yeah.
I mean, I've probably done it myself, right? Where you sit down and say, okay, today, Pamela, we want to get Pierre Poilievre explaining to us why he won't get security clearance or something like that.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
Judy Trin was screaming about last week and making a fool of herself over. That was quite embarrassing. Especially with an old question that's been asked and answered, right? If you've got
Asked
a
and
new angle
answered.
on
Yeah,
it, try something.
for sure.
But yeah, I think that's sort of it's been part of it has been the abandonment of the objective of objectivity,
Yeah.
the aspiration of objectivity. I'd say that's happened over the last 6-8 years, particularly in journalism. It's even been taught in some journalism classes, and people are saying, well, no, that's not. You don't get to the truth by being objective. That's two-sidism and all kinds of stuff. Well, of course, two-sidism is stupid. I mean, if you're talking to the phrase I use, if one guy says the moon is made of green cheese and you balance it by finding a guy who says, no, it's not, it's made of blue cheese, your story is still nonsense. You need as many voices as you can. But I think the public wants to be served objectively with news. They want you to try as hard as you can. We all have our biases, but to serve them the facts, as many facts and circumstances as you can around the news, and leave them free to draw their own conclusions. So when you frame the story for them, you're giving them a conclusion, and they resist that. So that media just continues in a downward spiral.
You hear that all the time, Peter, and I'm coming to you in a minute, Tara, but you hear it all the time, which is, I'm making this up, but it's a similar kind of thing. Pierre Poilievre, who has huge negatives with women in the public, just announced today his policy on, right? Like this is not providing context. It's providing a very narrow form of context. The opposite. We often hear about Mark Carney, with his resume, it's there.
Mark Carney, who saved civilization twice,
right?
announced
Exactly.
today that
Correct. So it's fact. There are facts involved in that. In both cases, he does have a resume, Pierre Poilievre number. But it sets the stage for how you even hear what it is you're about to hear.
It's an expression of a viewpoint. And I think that part of where this could be handled differently is in story meetings when this sort of thing is hashed out. If you had more viewpoints in a story meeting, you would have somebody say, that is speculation, or that is a particular political perspective, or that is an interpretation, or because they had a different view than you did. And so they would argue about it. But the problem with the monoculture and legacy media right now is that those conversations are not really being had in the newsrooms, or if they are, everyone's so terrified of social media that they're not expressing their true viewpoint on these things. So either you have everyone agreeing or everyone pretending to agree, but either way, it does not make for critical thinking, which is what we need to kind of remove some of those frames. And we have had some interesting examples of this during the election. Peter and I talked about the issue with Pierre Poilievre and his comments on a couple's biological clocks. You could see that framing very clearly in the coverage, particularly the opinion coverage on that.
So I'm going to quote Tara Henley to Tara Henley for a moment. Because it seems like a good moment. In resigning after 8 years at the CBC, she stated this, you stated this, to work at the CBC is to consent to the idea that a growing list of subjects are off the table, that dialogue itself can be harmful, that the big issues of our time are already settled. It is to capitulate to certainty, to shut down critical thinking, to stamp out curiosity. That is powerful and damning.
I was very, very frustrated when I wrote that. I had just spent a good 18 months in those story meetings doing exactly what I've just described to you, arguing and saying, but what about this? And what about that? And there's other ways to look at this, and there's other viewpoints. And so I was very, very frustrated at that time. But I think those points are still valid and still, I hope, would be helpful to the CBC to think about and incorporate. There's all kinds of issues that I think legacy media still considers off the table that are not off the table for kitchen table discussions all around this country, no matter how you vote. And when the gap between what is being discussed in homes and in coffee shops and in dog parks and on the bus and everywhere else, when the gap between that and what is discussed in our media becomes too big, it is unsustainable. And there's a number of consequences from that. First of all, we don't have an informed citizenry if we don't know what the range of views are. But second of all, we have surprises come at us during elections. And we saw that in the last election in the United States. I don't know if we will see that in this election, but there's certain issues that I've been monitoring that I really wonder if they will bubble up in this election. And we have.
Like what? Give us an example.
Yeah, so I think the issue around trans rights and how that is interpreted in this country is something that does not get talked about in legacy mass media at all. And it's become a mess, I think, for the country. For example, we just saw last week a lawsuit being filed by the Canadian Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms about trans inmates in women's prisons. So that's one side of the issue. But just the other side of the issue is I'm hearing from women that this move to all gender washrooms in the wake of the trans rights movement. So now I'm not talking about trans individuals in female washrooms. They're just talking about men in women's washrooms. I've been hearing from a lot of women that really dislike this for all kinds of reasons, including privacy, including menstruation, all kinds of reasons. That doesn't get aired in the public at all. We saw in the American election with women's sports that really bubbled up as a sleeper issue. I don't know if that will in the Canadian election. We have so many issues in this election, but it is something that could be discussed in the mainstream if it's being discussed everywhere else. We could do it.
Yeah, go ahead. No, I just want to go to Peter on a similar issue, because if you watch, if you consume some of your information online, watching Twitter, you can see, or X, sorry, you can see huge rallies of pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas supporters on Parliament Hill and other places almost on a daily basis. Some references to what Mr. Carney's position was when he agreed that a genocide was underway and then tried to correct. But again, this is a huge, powerful issue. Yes, it's foreign policy, but yes, it's very much the reality of what Canadians are experiencing on their streets in Vancouver and Saskatoon and Toronto, not getting a lot of traction.
No, it's not. I mean, but I think the public quite often just looks at that as just pandering for votes. Right. I mean, you get block voting from certain groups, and the Liberals kind of lost the sort of the more pro-Hamas left, and now they want to kind of keep that because they're catering to the NDP vote, and it's sort of like it's actually really interesting watching people dance around everything. Right. Like, I mean, Poilievre's position is very refreshing in that because he has one. Right. Yeah. Like, he's not afraid to say what it is. And he'll take the consequences and suffer from them, which would probably be overall negative in terms of votes. But I think, people do like a principled position on things. But obviously, the Liberals have a different point of view on that. In terms of lighting up the public, I think the public's just been so frightened of Trump that I think that we're actually starting to have a non-Trump election. The last week or so. Mm-hmm. But Trump really panicked the herd. And so, everybody rushed over here. Where are we going to be safe? They rush over there. Women over 60 are, that doesn't apply to either of you, I'm sure. But.
Boomers, yeah.
No, 39 again. But yeah, boomers in general, sort of just saying.
Boomers can't be trusted on this at all, right? They're my generation appears quite willing to put its children and grandchildren at risk, and not have the sort of discussion we should have. But anyway, it's hard for me to say what issues might pop up. I know here in Alberta, there's a lot of anxiety and fear, right? What am I going to do? Spend the rest? Am I going to end up spending the rest of my life fighting separatists and trying to keep Alberta and Saskatchewan's even more volatile?
Well, and that is a whole question, because to your point, Tara, about issues that are sort of considered settled, which may not be. I'm just going to say broadly, climate change, net zero. Mr. Carney is absolutely dedicated on this, literally wrote the book, all 500 pages of it on all of this, but won't commit to a pipeline. Said just in French the other night that of all these mega projects he's talking about, maybe some, maybe not. That's livelihood for hundreds of thousands of Canadians, not just in Alberta. And concerns about the climate are legit. So are we just not talking about it this round?
I think I think there's an issue of hierarchy of needs here. And I think that it is a generational divide. Like certainly those that I speak to under 40, it's the same with a lot of the big existential issues, climate change being one of them, but certainly Donald Trump being another one. That I think that if you own your own home, perhaps have a pension or have a very steady income that is not threatened at the moment, that you have a little bit of mental space to think about the broader, bigger issues that we face. And I'm trying to put this very charitably because I've heard from people in both camps, and both camps make sense to me. But if you are 36, 37, 32, you can't afford to buy a house. Certainly your rents have skyrocketed. You're putting together a couple different jobs to try to make a living. You don't see a family on the horizon for yourself. I mean, this is a very different state of being. And I think that the people who were talking about this before Donald Trump became a major election issue, and again this week we're starting to see this bubbling up again, I can't imagine that those people are going to forget everything that's happened in the last couple of years and forget their own material conditions and give the Liberals another shot at this. I find it very hard to wrap my mind around.
Yeah, Peter, you're alluding to this, that Trump he was the trigger for the election and the decision of large swaths of the population to say, there's the guy, his suit looks good and the CV is important, and we're not going to think about anything else. I heard somebody the other day, I was just saying this to Daryl Burker in our conversation this week. Somebody said, I don't know if he's married, I don't know if he has kids, I don't care. I mean,
some of that, I just wanted to go back to, what Tara was talking about, the narrowing of the window of discussion, right? Like that. I was on actually Kathleen Petty's show, Alberta at Noon, on CBC a couple of weeks ago. And I've known Kathleen for about 35 years. And I think I haven't been on her show for about 30. But anyway, it was nice. It was nice for her to have me on. And we talked about this a bit. And I said, here's the problem with journalism, that the narrower the mainstream media makes the discussion, and it's definitely doing that, the larger the fringes get. And then the mainstream, the fringe, like there are all these voices left and right that aren't getting included in there because of some sort of prissy decision making that, well, if we can let him on, then, we'll get all kinds of phone calls. We let her on and we'll get all kinds of, we don't want to do this. And, there's sort of fussing and an essential lack of courage, I think, that happens around that. So I really worry about that. And you look at the questions unasked. I mean, the question came up the other day. Poilievre was making some noise about it, that some journalist had asked Carney where he paid his taxes, right? And he wasn't getting an answer. Then Carney answered yesterday and that sort of stuff. What struck me is, how was that question not asked 3 months ago? I mean, the guy's got an Irish passport, a UK passport. He's lived abroad. Wouldn't that be just a routine question that in other countries people would ask? But it's like 3 months after he runs for the Liberal leadership, finally somebody asks that. What, is it impolite to ask those sorts of questions? Or it's the essential lack of curiosity in Canadian media that just floors me every day.
Well, actually, Daryl and I were having this conversation a couple of weeks ago, and it was very funny because he and I both agree that nobody has yet, please correct me if I'm wrong, nobody has asked yet of Mr. Carney, what was the conversation with Justin Trudeau the day that he phoned uh, Chrystia Freeland and said, "You're fired as finance minister, and Mark Carney's coming in." And 15 minutes later, it was clear that Mr. Carney was then going to go for the other job, which is the top job. Nobody has asked any of them what the hell happened that day. Isn't that pretty fundamental? It's how we all got here.
It would be like the greatest story ever. The drama. No, seriously, the drama behind that, right? Mm-hmm. One day you're going to be finance minister, and Krista's going to be this, and then Krista quits, and all of a sudden you shut up, and nobody asks. Nobody asks, "Did you accept to be finance minister? Did you do this?" Right. It's like there's some sort of I'll let Tara get into this, but it just drives me nuts.
It's a very small pool of journalists that has access, and it's a pool of journalists that all know each other and speak to each other. And again, this is about the narrowing of viewpoint diversity, and it's also about social media dominating the story a lot of the time and putting the parameters around what gets talked about and what doesn't get talked about. And so if you have a bunch of people who all see the main story as being about Poilievre's unlikability with women, for instance, and you're online all day long hearing from other journalists who also think that's the story, and you're at an event speaking to other journalists who also think that's the story, that's your story. And if you're the only ones getting in front of Poilievre, then that becomes the narrative, gets reinforced time and time and time again. What is exciting to me about independent media right now is that the amount of voices in the conversation are expanding exponentially, and enough of us are saying things that are not in that little bubble, and that gains its own momentum, then eventually the mainstream has to grapple with those questions. So I think it's a healthy counter check.
I'll give you an example. Give you an example here. Like during this period in this election, I've never seen it quite this intense before. I mean, Justin Trudeau had the freedom as prime minister and as liberal leader, which you would call them during the the caretaker convention, the caretaker, where you're caretaker. If something came up with COVID, he could act, right? The rules got changed for this election so that it expanded for, very nebulous foreign things, right? So Carney was, initially he talked to Trump, right? And that sort of stuff. And then the next thing, he's calling Keir Starmer, right? And then he's calling the president of Mexico. And then on the weekend, he was calling the Secretary General of NATO. There's nothing urgent that requires him. He just gets to step back into the role and do that. Anyway, I questioned it. I wrote a Substack about it. Yeah. And actually, the Globe and Mail wrote an editorial about it, after having read my Substack on it in terms of that. But what struck me was on X, Twitter, when I raised the issue, I heard from a couple of journalists that were, "Oh, come on, Peter, we all know that's okay." And my response was, not the political scientists I talked to. And you could tell they hadn't even checked. Yeah. Right? I mean, you can decide it's okay. And there's
rules. Yeah.
Yeah, there's nothing illegal happening. But my take on it is that he's taking advantage of it and in an inappropriate way. Others are free to disagree. But don't you think it'd be worth asking the question? Exactly. No, but they just blow past this stuff like, "Oh, Peter, don't be so silly. We all know this is."
And just the when Mark Carney says he's going to suspend his campaign and go back to Ottawa, the campaign isn't suspended. The ads are still on television. The signs are still on the road. People are still knocking on doors. There's no suspension of the campaign. He's just changed his venue, Tara.
Well, he's changed the conversation.
He is campaigning. He is playing the role of prime minister. That is
which is his strongest mode.
It is a successful strategy for him at this point in time, which is all the more reason for the media to be thinking critically about this. That's all the more reason for us to be talking about it.
Yeah. What is the fear? I kind of will go back to the beginning, Peter, on this question. I mean, do they just not want to challenge each other or be the leader of the pack or question the guy who is going to give them a ton more money. Like this is basic kind of who, what, where, when, and why, right? It's journalism 101 to be asking these questions.
Well, it always struck me with journalists is that so many of them, us at times, fancied themselves as this rugged individualist, striding out there bravely, asking questions, holding people in power accountable, and that sort of stuff. But when they get together in a group, it's just like any other sort of social group. Like, what are you worried about? And then they often quite report and write, I think, for each other.
Yeah.
As their main audience, so they can sit down there and somebody says, "Hey, that was a great read, Peter, yesterday. Hey,
And
Tara, that really liked your piece," and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
That becomes your feedback loop.
let me also, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Let me also just say that going against the pack does have consequences. And I can speak from personal experience on that.
Me too.
It is not a pleasant experience. And, for a couple of weeks after my piece went viral, and I don't talk about this much because no one should feel sorry for me. I'm an adult. I'm fine. But, I had numerous hit pieces written on me. None of them, not a single one, called for comment. They were riddled with outright mischaracterizations and in some cases false information. And it was extremely, extremely unpleasant for at least 3 weeks, maybe 4, with people just saying terrible, terrible things on social media. It's not a fun experience. What I think that we all need to learn in the media is that only can happen in atmosphere where everybody is afraid, and where everybody is afraid not just about crossing certain lines, but also an environment where our finances are so insecure that the competition is so high and the need to conform is so high. But also that I think a lesson to be learned here is it's really not the end of the world. It did not end my career. I'm fine. Yeah. You come out of it, and what you learn is that you do have the ability to say these things. Life will not end, and it makes you a better journalist in the end. So I think there's a lot to be learned from that. But I do think the stakes are high. So I understand why people are frightened.
Peter,
that's what I had a very brief experience in the Parliamentary Press Gallery for a couple months in 1995, which included the referendum. But I remember quite distinctly one time sitting down at a table in a pub someplace with a group of other journalists, and I said something like, I don't see any reason why governments shouldn't strive to balance their budgets, right? And everybody went quiet, kind of looked at me, and I was like, what did I do?
Yeah.
Right? And it was like they'd never heard that before. Oh, that's the guy from Alberta. That's the Calgary Herald guy. Of course, those guys, that sort of stuff. But it's not an illegitimate point of view. I hadn't said anything racist or derogatory or, crazy like that. But it's just those subtle little things. And so it makes it hard, and it requires a great deal of courage to act independently within that sort of social atmosphere, which in my view is why nobody should belong to the Parliamentary Press Gallery for more than 5 years at a time without being pulled out, taken home. You could send them back again.
Yeah.
But you need to
go back to the regions and get in touch. Yeah.
Take them, bring them home and deprogram them. All right.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is now increasingly true just in conversation. I mean, I come from Saskatchewan, so I talk about agriculture and I talk about oil and gas and I talk about those things in a way that I find people in Ottawa or Toronto looking at me as if I have 3 heads. I mean, I was explaining to them about EVs not working in temperatures below -10 and having no charging stations. Where I live in Saskatchewan, I'm 3.5 hours from an airport. Not an option. Whether it's 2035 or not, this is not going to work. And they instead of saying, oh, really, that I hadn't thought of it that way, it's just dismissive. You're just a climate denier. Like the conversations have become very constrained and intimidating in that sense, Peter.
Yeah, very few people in Ottawa are aware of the fact, talk about things, that Calgary, for instance, is 400 miles north of Ottawa, right? It's basically Moose Factory, or from an Ontario point of view, right?
Excellent point.
So
I'm going to steal that and use
there's
it.
a
Thank
reason
you.
there's a reason it used to be called the Northwest Territories, right? It isn't just west; it's north. We have severe Arctic winters, and Saskatchewan's
Yes,
even
we
worse
do.
because the wind
Yep.
gets to blow for like 500 miles and build up before it hits Pamela Wallen's house.
It's true.
Um, yeah, and I mean, but it's those loss of perspectives, and the difference and the failure to recognize the huge geography and different points of view. And this is one of CBC's great failings. Like
Yeah.
I discovered this once and used it and use it from time to time. It's actually a longer flight from Calgary to Ottawa than it is from London to Moscow, and sometimes it feels the same.
Yeah. In
So.
terms of what you find at the other, exactly.
Another part of this is structural as well, right? Because as we've had the consolidation of the media, now you have almost all media workers living in Toronto and Montreal. That's certainly the case for the CBC. And so you also, as we've lost a lot of local news outlets and lost that ability for people to work in the regions and work their way up. So by the time they get to Ottawa, they've had all those experiences. Now we've lost so many local news outlets that we don't have that same career path anymore. So you have this set of perspectives that is very unique to the rest of the country. Very secular, for example, very urban, very progressive, very, very well educated. Lots of journalists now have master's degrees. This is not representative of the rest of the population at all. And so it becomes more and more of an echo chamber.
I want to ask a couple of things because, and I'll just put them out there and then kind of pick in which order you each want to deal with it. Buttongate. Okay, this is about party operatives being dumb enough, never mind whether their activity is illegal, but dumb enough to sit in a bar and brag about it, especially when a journalist identifies themselves. Whether or not Pierre Poilievre cut off his nose to spite his face by not putting reporters on the train and the boat and the plane and limiting questions. And then I want to get into I guess, foreign interference, but the Chinese interference particularly. So, Peter, do you want to start on any of those, and we'll touch on all three?
Sure. Buttongate. What struck me about that was that the guys didn't get fired.
Yeah,
I just find that, well, two things. I don't know why CBC, be fair to say, did a good job, but it was kind of by accident. It's the old proof that for journalists, hanging around in bars pays dividends, right? People speak too loudly. They have loose lips. They're sinking ships, that sort of stuff. So the reporter discovered that basically by overhearing these guys because she was pursuing the other angle. So that's the one side, but I don't know why she didn't name them. And I didn't get an explanation for it. If there's a reason, they should explain it, because otherwise they're just unnamed. But for a guy who, what struck me with the Carney thing was, he seems to have trouble like firing people or taking firm positions and being, like really taking the reins of that sort of stuff. Because in politics, firing those guys is pretty much a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Right. For a guy who's selling himself as I'll stand up to Trump, and you can't fire these goofs within your war room, right? That struck me as odd, and of course, very poor form on the part of the Liberals. Or if the Conservatives had done it, would have been very poor form on their part. Mm-hmm. Their part too. On Poilievre, the not taking the questions and not putting. I mean, if I was him, like as a journalist, it's difficult for me to sort of stick up for that and say, great, he's restricting access and that sort of stuff. So I don't really approve of that, but it's not so much the number of the questions that get asked. We had this fuss like last week. Everybody was adding up the number of questions. Like this was clearly something the Liberals were very proud of. That Carney's taken 150 questions and Poilievre's only taken 50 or something. I mean, feel free to correct me on those numbers. I'm sort of picking them out of the air. But it's kind of like, well, so how many of them did Carney answer?
Yeah.
Right. And what were the questions? Like the phrase I used in my blog was, or Substack was, if it's the Toronto Sun asking Poilievre, why are you so awesome? And the Toronto Star asking Carney, how did you ever get so smart? Right?
Right.
I mean, this isn't really getting us anywhere, right? So, I mean, as long as the main issues are addressed and that sort of stuff, I don't see where it's gone by. I mean, the media don't like Poilievre because of it. I'm not sure they would have treated him any better if he had
Yeah, don't think they
them
liked it
tag
before.
along.
Yeah.
I mean, so if I were them, that's what I would have done. I mean, I'm not saying it's excusable, but if I were them, I wouldn't let Judy Trin on the plane either.
Yeah. Just Tara, to you, just because Peter twigged me by saying that Carney has a difficult time firing people, the two operatives, but that was a huge issue with the Chinese candidate in the Markham area, where eventually the guy had to quit. And then the person that they replaced him with, and this is a Carney hands-on choice, has just as questionable a background in terms of his relations with the Chinese Communist Party.
That story, the Paul Chang story, was really strange to me. I found it really bizarre that that didn't get more coverage. I mean, for listeners and viewers, what he was talking about was he had made a comment calling on people to turn in his opponent, who is a conservative politician, to the Chinese Communist Party.
Yep.
I mean, that is an astonishing remark to say in a sovereign democracy. It did not get a lot of coverage at all. And I thought the Liberals handled it very, very poorly. But again, when we're really distracted and we're following Twitter for our news ideas, all of these other stories are going to fall by the wayside, because it's really just a matter of what's trending as opposed to what's significant and important. I found that one very, very telling about where we're at as a media right now.
I've got to say, and I've covered an awful lot of elections in my life, just for some sense of dignity. I won't tell you the very first one I covered. It was so long ago. But I've got to say, this one for me, and I'm obviously not covering it in the journalistic world, I spend probably 3 hours a day, maybe more, some days more, listening to podcasts. I read a lot on X and other sites like the Hub, where you guys do your thing. There's a lot of good information out there. It takes a lot of work to get to it. And if I were working 14 hours a day, doing some overtime and trying to deal with affordability issues, I wouldn't have the luxury of doing that. So I think I can inform myself, but it takes me my working day. Peter?
Yeah, it does. I mean, the Chinese interference story is one that just absolutely baffles me, because I don't understand. We've had the full inquiry.
Yeah.
We've had evidence from the last election. That, I mean, very clearly, those Vancouver seats may have got a different outcome. But there's this general sort of shrug that says, well, it didn't really change the election, right? Well, it did for that guy.
Yeah.
And yet there's no response, right? I mean, this came out like a couple of weeks ago that they're pumping Carney's tires, right? And Carney says, I don't know anything about it. Nobody, and like I said, nobody seems to know anything. I don't know nothing, right? Like, don't look at me. Do something about it.
Yeah.
But if you want to play prime minister in the middle of an election, why don't you tell us what you've told China, right? No, everybody, and the Conservatives are similar. Nobody seems to want to stand up to China, right? And when this stuff comes along, nobody files a complaint. I mean, our security watchdog says that China is interfering with our election, right? And nobody does anything, right? And the reporters, sort of like Tarrant was referring to, they kind of go, yeah, well, it's just, I mean, that's, I don't know, ethnic politics or something, the way, whatever it is they're saying. And I'm not saying that's appropriate. But in terms of that, they just seem to kind of let it go. And I think these are really big issues. This is if you're begging for government subsidies on the basis that you are defenders of democracy, get off your backside and defend it.
I found that even in the whole framing of the campaign back at the beginning, which, as we've noted, Trump just changed the game, right? He came in, said 51st state, and all of a sudden, you've got Mike Myers and you've got Canadians canceling holiday plans and looking at the labels on everything that they buy, as if these were two separate things, that you could not have an issue with Trump and his tariffs and his intentions on the trade front, and have a conversation about the issues we have at home that are longstanding, that are self-imposed. We've had interprovincial trade barriers, or printing money, or any number of things, growing deficits. That you can't blame on Trump. And those are two conversations you could be having together, Tara.
Absolutely, you could. And I think, just to be totally fair to journalists in this conversation, I do think there is a level of overwhelm happening right now as well. And I mean, I certainly feel it. I've talked to Peter about this. I have a hard time keeping up. It's that we're moving at digital speed. There's so much happening all the time. Donald Trump is a news-making machine.
Well, if you stay up 24 hours a day, it works that way.
And we are all under-resourced and, overworked and tired. And so I think sometimes I do think there's a sort of blasé attitude of, well, this isn't important, this is a nothing burger. But at other times, I do think there's a real overwhelm factor as well that has to be kind of at least acknowledged.
But honestly, we've been having these discussions in this country for a very long time. I mean, I can cite 3 or 4 studies that looked at interprovincial trade barriers that I worked on in the Senate personally. It's not like it's a novel concept. So again, it's saying, look, we've got to clean up our own house. And yes, he's created a whole bunch of new issues for us. But instead, we've just turned this into, okay, we have a bad guy and it's external. So that means we don't have to look at our own issues and take some more responsibility, whether it's defense spending or whatever it may be. Is that fair, or am I being too critical?
I think that is the frame. I'm not convinced that that's where the public is at. I don't know, as I said kind of earlier in the conversation, I don't know that you can be kind of running bang smack up into the walls in this country right now that are affecting real material conditions on the ground, housing, jobs, all those kinds of things. I don't think you can be dealing with that on a day-to-day basis and just forget. So I'm not convinced that the narrative that we're seeing in the media is the narrative on the ground. And I will have to just see. We'll have to see.
Okay, the prime example of that, Peter, I don't know. I had one of the pollsters went out and asked the question, and a significant majority, I don't know if it was 57 or 58%, of people gave Mark Carney credit for doing away with, at least temporarily, the carbon tax. If you're sitting in the Tory war room that morning and you've just spent the last 3 years of your life talking about this every day, it must be frustrating.
Really. I mean, but I did a little little scan myself of how media covered that, and generally, the media just gave Carney credit for it. I mean, they actually, the CBC actually did the best job and had background about Poilievre and that sort of stuff, and the whole story of the carbon tax and Justin Trudeau digging his heels in and that sort of stuff. So you could actually read it and take a look at it and say, oh, okay, well, this guy, Pierre Poilievre, actually killed the carbon tax, right? Carney just...
That's why we're having an election.
Exactly. But I mean, Global was brutal. They had a lead that was, sort of God bless Mark Carney. The carbon tax prices fell in Winnipeg yesterday thanks to Mark Carney and the Liberal, and never mentioned Poilievre at all. So I mean, that sort of naked bias in reporting is I find it shocking. I find it actually, as an old editor and that sort of stuff. Like, how does that stuff get through? without somebody firing it back and saying, what, gee, like a little bit of balance here, right? Can we have
Yeah.
I mean, just one, give me a nut graph, paragraph, right?
Context, right?
Carney's
Context.
move followed 2 years of work by the Conservatives to bring down the Trudeau government and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And then you can go on and do what you want. But that's just poor journalism. So of course people get that impression because they watch the news.
Tara, just a final point on I think Peter's 1,000% right. We've lost that whole editorial process, that editor role in mainstream media of just having, and with people working so, separately, even in the mainstream media, there's not that conversation, which is, oh, that's an interesting story, but are you sure? Maybe you should make another call on that. So we've got our eyes focused on that. On the social media, there's no editing process either at all, other than you get a much more direct feedback, I guess, from the public or from other people who read, who write in, who respond to a tweet and say, you're dead wrong and here's why. So that may be the substitute process for what Peter says no longer exists.
It may be, but I would like to see the journalistic standards and practices revisited. I mean, everyone on social media has bias too, right? And I think that we have to find a way of bringing back some of the standards and practices that we have had for a long time. And the first one we can start with is just saying we want to be objective. There's a lot of newsrooms that don't believe in that anymore. They don't. They just they don't uphold that. That's not their aim. So they believe that it's better to be transparent, to state your biases. Fine. But the evidence I can see from the public is the public doesn't want that. So then if we want to serve the public, we need to go back to being objective. We know that it's an imperfect aspiration. We know it's an ideal, right, but at least striving towards that. Then you do naturally ask a series of questions, which is like, what are other views on this? What's another way of thinking about this? So I think it needs to happen in the newsrooms, and I think it needs to start with embracing that objectivity again.
So that's sort of just going back on that. The relationship that needs to be the strongest is the one between the reader and the writer. When it comes to this sort of stuff, and that's one of the problems with subsidies, is it undermines that connection. It weakens it. It's not like it's still not there. But journalists need to remember they are there to serve the public, not their cause or their bias and that sort of stuff. And when they abandon that, the problem is with subsidies, they can abandon it, so they need more subsidies. So you end up not doing good journalism. You end up subsidizing bad journalism, potentially increasingly bad journalism, instead of reinforcing the need to serve the reader the way they want to be read, or listener or viewer the way they want to be served.
Old school editors, a lot of them did not vote. They did not vote in elections.
I did not. When I interviewed the prime ministers every year at the year ender, I didn't vote in that period of my journalistic life.
Yeah. I'm not voting in this election. I'm not going to vote because I want the public to know. Of course, I have my own thoughts and biases and opinions and all the rest, but I want the public to know that my allegiance is to the public.
Yeah.
Yeah. Most of the guys I used to work with didn't want to. They said, "I'm not voting. I don't want to encourage them."
Well, there was that view as well. Thank you both very much. This is a really, I think, timely and good conversation because there's a high level of frustration out there. So thanks for giving us some context and framing for us all what we should be looking at. Great to see you both. Peter Menzies, his Substack, The Rewrite, and the Hub podcast with Tara Henley. That's called The Full Press. Her own is called Lean Out. So look for all of those things. There's some really good material there in our alternative world out here of doing podcasts and Substacks. And I think you can inform yourself if you've got a little time in the day to spare. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Tara. We'll talk soon.
Thanks so much. This was fun.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks all of you for watching, and we'll see you again very soon. That's it for No Nonsense.